Your merger will fail in 72 hours. The voice came from behind him, calm, steady, almost casual, as if she were commenting on the weather instead of the fate of a $100 million deal. Ethan Cole did not look up immediately, because in his world people said things like that all the time. Analysts trying to sound insightful, competitors trying to create doubt, founders trying to sound bigger than they were. Most of it was noise, and Ethan had built his career on filtering noise. The soft hum of conversation drifted through the restaurant, low voices, quiet laughter, the gentle clinking of silverware against porcelain, the kind of atmosphere designed to make power feel effortless. Ethan sat still at the center of it, his attention fixed on the glowing screen of his phone, where numbers moved in clean, predictable patterns. Numbers did not lie, people did, and that had always been the rule he trusted more than anything else. But something about the voice behind him did not fit that rule, not the words, but the certainty behind them, the lack of hesitation, the absence of any need to convince him. That was what made him look up, slowly, deliberately, because instinct was the one thing he trusted more than data when something felt wrong. When his eyes lifted, she was already watching him, standing beside the table in a simple black apron, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. She did not look nervous. She did not look impressed. She did not look like she was trying to belong in that moment. And that was the first thing that did not make sense. Because she did not belong there. Not in that conversation. Not anywhere near a deal that had taken 18 months to build. And yet she spoke about it like she already knew how it ended. Ethan studied her for a moment. Not long. Just enough to recognize that whatever this was, it was not random. That is a very specific prediction, he said, his voice even, controlled. The same tone he used in boardrooms when everything depended on staying calm. It is not a prediction, she replied, meeting his gaze without hesitation. It is already happening. The words settled between them, quiet but heavy, as if they carried more weight than they should have. Nothing in the room changed. The conversations continued. The glasses clinked. The world moved exactly as it had before, but something between them shifted, subtle but irreversible. Ethan leaned back slightly, not in discomfort, but in recalibration, because now he was not listening to her words, he was measuring them. No one outside his inner circle knew the deal was unstable. No one knew about the hesitation from his largest investor. No one knew how close everything was to breaking beneath the surface. That information was contained, controlled, protected. So how did she know? His eyes moved over her again, slower this time, taking in the details, the uniform, the notebook at her side, the stillness in the way she stood. You do not look like someone who belongs in this conversation, he said. For the first time, her expression shifted slightly, not offended, not defensive, just aware. And you do not look like someone who misses things this obvious, she replied. That should have ended the conversation. It should have been dismissed, categorized, ignored, but it was not. Instead, it held him there, caught between logic and something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Ethan set his phone down slowly, the screen dimming as the numbers disappeared, the deal, the room, everything else fading just enough for her to take their place. What exactly am I missing? He asked, his tone lower now, more focused. She did not answer immediately, instead reaching for the empty glass on his table and refilling it with slow, precise movements. The people you think are negotiating with you, she said, are not negotiating. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. They are waiting. For what? For you to stop seeing the pattern. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not forced, just enough to matter. Ethan looked at her again, this time not as a distraction, but as a variable, something unexpected in a system he understood too well. Who are you? He asked. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then stepped back. Lily, she said, Lily Carter. And just like that, she turned and disappeared into the rhythm of the restaurant, blending into movement as if she had never been there at all. But Ethan did not look away. His eyes remained fixed on the space she had occupied, because for reasons he could not yet explain, he believed her just enough to be dangerous. And in his world, that was more than enough to change everything. Ethan did not finish his drink. He left it untouched on the table as he stepped out into the cool Manhattan night, the air sharper than it should have been, carrying a clarity that felt almost intrusive. The city moved around him in its usual rhythm, taxis cutting through traffic, lights reflecting across glass towers, voices blending into a constant hum. But none of it held his attention the way it normally would. Because his mind was no longer on the deal. It was on her. 72 hours. He repeated the number silently as he walked, not because he doubted it, but because of the way she had said it, with a certainty that left no room for interpretation. His driver pulled up before he reached the curb, the door opening smoothly, but Ethan paused for just a moment before getting in. He turned slightly, glancing back at the restaurant. Through the glass, everything looked normal, people seated, conversations continuing, movement flowing without interruption. There was no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been part of that moment at all. Ethan stepped into the car and closed the door. "Get me everything on her," he said. His voice was quiet, but precise. Daniel did not ask unnecessary questions. "Who exactly?" "Lily Carter," Ethan said. A brief pause followed. "A waitress. Speaks multiple languages. And she knows about the Blackridge deal." The silence on the other end of the line was short, but heavy, just enough to signal that Daniel understood the implication. "I'll start digging," he said. The car moved forward, smooth and controlled, the city sliding past in clean, predictable patterns, everything exactly as it should have been. But inside Ethan's head, nothing was aligned. He replayed the conversation, every word, every shift in tone, not for meaning, but for intent. People did not speak like that unless they knew something, and if they knew something, it came from somewhere. Information had structure. Leaks had sources. Everything connected if you followed it far enough. That was the system he trusted. So why could he not place her? Ethan leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a moment, mapping possibilities. A leak from inside his team. Unlikely, but not impossible. A competitor placing someone closer. Possible, but inefficient, too exposed, too visible. Unless the visibility was the cover. His eyes opened again as the car turned onto a quieter street. For the first time in a long time, the system did not feel clear. And that was the problem. His phone buzzed. "Daniel." "Already." "Nothing concrete yet," Daniel said. "But something's off." Ethan did not respond immediately. He was already expecting that. "There are records," Daniel continued, "but no continuity. No stable address. No employment history that holds. Everything resets after a few months." Ethan's expression remained unchanged, but something beneath it tightened. "She just appeared," Daniel added. Ethan looked out the window again, slower this time. "No," he said quietly. "She didn't appear." A brief pause. "She was placed." The words settled differently. Daniel did not respond right away. "That's a different kind of problem," he said finally. Ethan did not answer, because he already understood that. This was not random. It was not coincidence. It was structure, and structure meant design. By the time the car pulled up to his building, one thing was clear. The deal was not the only thing moving. Something else had already started. Something he had not seen. Something he had not controlled. And that was the first real risk. By 7 the next morning, the conference room felt different. Nothing had changed on the surface. The same glass walls, the same long table, the same quiet hum of screens coming to life. But something in the air had tightened in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was not tension in the usual sense, not pressure from deadlines or expectations, but something quieter, more precise, like a system adjusting before revealing what it had been hiding. Ethan stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled back, his posture relaxed in a way that usually meant control, but this time it meant focus. "Run it again," he said. No explanation. No context. Just instruction. The analysts exchanged brief glances, confusion contained but present. "We already verified everything," one of them said carefully. Ethan did not look at him. "Run it again," he repeated. A short pause. Slower. Line by line. That was enough. Screens shifted, documents reopened, numbers recalculated, the process slowing down in a way that felt unnatural in a room built for efficiency. At first, nothing changed. Everything aligned exactly as it had before, clean, structured, predictable. And that should have been reassuring. It was not, because now they were looking for something else. Not confirmation. Disruption. "This section," one analyst said after several minutes, his voice lower now, more careful. Ethan stepped closer, just enough to signal attention. "The delay clause," the analyst continued. "It looks standard, but the approval chain isn't." Ethan's expression remained neutral. "Explain." The analyst hesitated, scrolling deeper, cross-referencing. Originally, it required a single investor confirmation, he said. But now it routes through an additional holding entity. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't flagged. No, the analyst admitted. It blends in unless you're specifically looking for it. That was the moment it shifted. Not visibly, but internally, because that was not an error. Errors stand out. This did not. This hid. Who owns the entity? Ethan asked. Another pause, longer this time. It traces back to a shell company, the analyst said. Recently established. No clear ownership. Silence followed, not confusion, but recognition. Because everyone in that room understood what that meant. Not a mistake. Intent. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in confirmation. Because now the pattern was visible, and once a pattern revealed itself, it could not be ignored. Who reviewed this section? He asked. A shift at the far end of the table, subtle but controlled. I did. Victor Hale. Senior strategist, trusted, consistent, the kind of presence that blended into the system so well it was rarely questioned. Ethan looked at him, not long, just enough. Victor held the gaze without hesitation. No defensiveness. No explanation offered. That, more than anything, made it dangerous. Keep going, Ethan said. The meeting continued, but it was no longer analysis. It was excavation. Layer by layer, inconsistencies surfaced, timelines slightly misaligned, approvals delayed just enough to matter, communication gaps that were not obvious until they were viewed together. Individually, nothing significant. Together, a system. And systems did not happen by accident. By the time the room cleared, only Ethan and Daniel remained. This was built, Daniel said quietly. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the city below, not for answers, but for scale. From the inside, he replied. A brief pause. And we didn't see it. Daniel hesitated. Do you think it's Victor? Ethan did not answer immediately, because the question was not who. Not yet. The question was how far it went. And that was the part they had not uncovered yet. Across the city, in a quiet corner of a public library, Lily Carter sat alone at a small wooden table, her posture still, her focus absolute, as if the noise of the world outside had no permission to reach her. A cup of coffee rested beside her, untouched, the surface long gone cold. Forgotten the moment, she opened the notebook in front of her. Her fingers moved steadily across the page, not writing sentences, but mapping something, fragments of numbers, arrows, connections that only made sense when seen together. To anyone else, it would have looked disorganized. To her, it was structure. The same structure she had seen before. Different names, different companies, different markets, but always the same pattern beneath it. Slow pressure, invisible shifts, an outcome that appeared natural but never was. Her pen paused for a moment, hovering above the page, as if something in the pattern had changed. Her phone buzzed softly against the table. She glanced at the screen without picking it up immediately, her expression unchanged. When she finally read the message, her eyes lingered for just a second longer than necessary. They are accelerating. She read it again, not for understanding, but for confirmation. Then her gaze returned to the notebook. The lines she had drawn, the connections she had built, all of it still held, but the timing did not. Her pen moved again, adjusting one sequence, shifting another, tightening the space between events that were no longer as far apart as she had expected. 72 hours. That was the number she had given him. That was the window she believed still existed. Now it felt wrong. Too long. Too safe. Her jaw tightened slightly, the smallest change in an otherwise controlled expression. Because Ethan Cole was not behaving the way the pattern required. He was not observing. He was not hesitating. He was moving. Faster than expected. More directly than anyone had planned for. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Shorter this time. Sharper. He knows too much. Lily closed her eyes briefly, not in fear, but in calculation, adjusting, recalibrating, trying to understand how far the shift had already gone. Then she exhaled slowly and set the phone down. Then we are out of time, she said quietly to herself. The words did not carry emotion. They carried certainty. Because this was no longer about preventing the outcome. That part had already passed. This was about managing what came next. She closed the notebook and rested her hand on it for a moment, grounding herself before standing. For the first time, her reflection caught faintly in the window beside her. And for a brief moment, It did not look like a waitress. It looked like someone who had been inside this system before. Someone who understood not just how it worked, but how it ended. Lily picked up her coat and stepped away from the table, her movements calm again, controlled, as if the urgency beneath the surface had already been contained. But it had not disappeared, because somewhere across the city, Ethan was getting closer to the truth. And the closer he got, the faster everything would move against him. She walked toward the exit without looking back, blending into the quiet movement of the library, just another presence among many. But unlike the others, she was not there to read, or to wait, or to pass time. She was there because she knew what was coming. And more importantly, she knew it had already begun. Ethan did not return to the conference room after the meeting ended. He walked straight past it, past the familiar rhythm of his team resetting for the next phase, past the structure that had always made sense to him, because something about it no longer did. The hallway felt longer than usual, quieter, as if the building itself had shifted into a different version of reality where control was no longer assumed. You are already too close. Her words returned again, not as memory, but as something unresolved, something that had not finished unfolding. Ethan stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, the soft click echoing slightly in the silence. For a moment, he did nothing. No calls, no data, no movement. He stood there, looking at the reflection of the city in the glass wall, the same skyline he had always used to measure progress, success, certainty. There had been a time when everything felt simple. Information came in, patterns formed, decisions followed, outcomes aligned. That was the system he built his entire career on. Data did not lie, people did. But now the data was telling a story he did not understand. And that was the one thing he had never prepared for. His phone buzzed. Daniel. Ethan answered immediately. We're going deeper, Daniel said. There's no continuity in her records. Everything resets. Every trace breaks after a short window. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the glass. She's not hiding from me, he said quietly. A brief pause followed. She's hiding from whoever built this. Daniel did not respond right away. That changes the scale, he said finally. No, Ethan replied. It confirms it. Because now the question was no longer whether there was a system. It was how long it had already been running. Ethan ended the call before anything else could be said, not out of dismissal, but because the conversation had already reached its limit. Information was no longer enough. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through contacts he rarely used, layers of access that existed for moments exactly. Like this. Then he stopped. One number. Unlisted. Unlabeled. But there. Waiting. He looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, then pressed call. The line connected faster than expected. You are moving too fast, her voice said. Quieter this time, but heavier. Ethan looked out at the skyline, the reflections fractured across the glass. You told me I had 72 hours, he said. I told you to see it, she replied. Not to break it. That was the shift. Subtle, but real. She was no longer guiding him. She was reacting to him. That is not how I work, Ethan said. I know, she answered. No judgment. No hesitation. Just certainty. Then you know I am not going to stop. A brief silence followed. Not empty. Held. I also know, she said slowly, that once you push this far, there is no stepping back. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, not to think, but to confirm the decision he had already made. Then tell me why you are still helping me, he said. This time, she did not answer immediately, and that hesitation changed something. Because for the first time, she was not completely certain. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Lower. Less controlled. Because you are not supposed to lose like this. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the phone. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are getting. The line went dead. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the glass. For the first time, it did not look like control. It looked like something else. Something closer to awareness. Because now he understood one thing clearly. She was not trying to stop what was coming. She was trying to prepare him for it. And that meant whatever had already started could not be stopped. The realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, until it became impossible to ignore. Ethan stood alone in his office, the city stretching beyond the glass, but he was no longer looking at it the way he used to. Because now every decision he had made over the past weeks felt different. Not wrong. Directed. That was the part that unsettled him. If the outcome had already been set in motion, then every move he made had not been leading the system. It had been feeding it. His phone buzzed. Daniel. Ethan answered immediately. We found something, Daniel said. His tone was tighter now, less controlled. Ethan did not respond. He was already expecting that. Victor authorized a secondary approval chain 2 weeks ago, Daniel continued. It was labeled as a contingency, but it was never disclosed to the board. Ethan walked slowly toward the window, his reflection faint in the glass. That is not the problem, he said quietly. There was a brief pause on the line. Daniel understood. You are right, he said. The problem is where it leads. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Because this was the part that mattered. The shell company connected to that chain routes through a parent firm overseas, Daniel said. Ethan stopped moving. And that firm, Daniel continued, has direct ties to Ardent Global. Silence settled in the room. Not confusion. Recognition. Because Ardent Global was not just a competitor. It was the only company with the reach, the capital, and the positioning to absorb everything if the deal collapsed. Not compete. Replace. This was never negotiation, Ethan said. His voice was calm, but colder now. This was acquisition through collapse. Exactly, Daniel replied. And Victor is at the center of it. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the phone, but his expression did not change. Because now the structure was clear. This was not betrayal in the way people usually understood it. This was placement. Victor was not acting alone. He was part of something larger, something built long before Ethan noticed the cracks. Ethan ended the call without another word. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because the next step did not require discussion. He turned back toward his desk, but did not sit. Did not open the files. Did not look at the numbers. Because none of that mattered anymore. The pattern was already visible. And once a pattern revealed itself, analysis was no longer enough. He picked up his phone again and dialed Victor Hale directly. The line rang once, then connected. Ethan, Victor said. His voice was smooth, controlled exactly. As it had always been. Too controlled. We need to talk about the approval chain, Ethan said. No introduction. No hesitation. A brief pause followed. I was planning to address that in tomorrow's meeting, Victor replied. Ethan stepped closer to the window, his reflection clearer now. Tomorrow is too late, he said. Another pause. Longer this time. I assure you everything is under control, Victor said carefully. Ethan let out a slow breath. That is exactly what concerns me, he replied. Silence followed. Not neutral. Active. Both of them recalculating. Victor did not respond immediately. And that hesitation was enough. Not proof. Confirmation. Ethan's voice dropped slightly. I will see you tonight, he said. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. Because now this was no longer about uncovering the system. It was about forcing it to react. And when a system reacts, it reveals what it was designed to hide. The meeting was set for 9:30 that night, far above the city, in a private lounge where conversations were not recorded and decisions were never written down. Ethan arrived exactly on time, his pace steady, his expression unreadable, because control at this level was no longer about urgency, it was about presence. Victor Hale was already there, seated comfortably, one hand resting lightly on the table, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence, or the performance of it. You wanted to talk, Victor said. His tone was smooth, unchanged, as if this were still routine. Ethan did not sit immediately. He let the silence stretch for a moment, just enough to shift the balance, just enough to make it clear that this was no longer a conversation Victor controlled. Then he took the seat across from him. I reviewed the approval chain, Ethan said. No emotion, no accusation, just fact. Victor nodded slightly. It is complex, he replied. Necessary for a deal of this size. Ethan held his gaze. It is not complex, he said. A brief pause. It is altered. The shift was subtle, but real. Victor leaned back slightly, folding his hands together, adjusting without acknowledging it. If you have concerns, we can address them in the morning. Meeting, he said. This is not a concern, Ethan replied. It is a strategy. Silence followed, heavier now, more defined. Victor did not respond immediately, and that hesitation carried more weight than anything he could have said. You are reading too much into procedural adjustments, he said finally, but the control in his voice was thinner now. Ethan leaned forward slightly. The shell company routes through Ardent Global, he said. And you signed off on it. Victor did not deny it. Not directly. Instead, he studied Ethan, measuring him, recalculating, as if deciding how much of the truth could exist in this room. You should be careful with assumptions, Victor said. Not everything is what it appears. Ethan almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. That would mean more, he said quietly, if you were not sitting at the center of it. Victor's jaw tightened slightly. You already know enough to be dangerous, he said. And that was it. Not an admission. Not a denial. Something in between. Something that confirmed everything. Ethan leaned back, reclaiming space, letting the silence settle before speaking again. Dangerous is not a position I mind being in, he said. Victor's gaze hardened. You are not seeing the full picture, he replied. You think this is about one deal, one competitor. A brief pause. It is bigger than that. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. Then explain it, he said. Victor hesitated, longer this time, and that hesitation was the answer. Because whatever this was, it extended beyond him. You cannot stop what is already in motion, Victor said quietly. The decision was made long before you saw the cracks. The words aligned too easily with everything Ethan had already begun to understand. This was not a shift. This was a system that had been running long before he entered it. So you chose to be part of it, Ethan said. Victor stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. Sometimes you do not choose the outcome, he said. You choose where you stand when it happens. Ethan rose as well. His expression remained calm, but something beneath it had changed. Then you chose wrong, he said. Victor paused at the door, just for a moment, then. Look back. And in that brief second, something passed across his face. Not fear. Not confidence. Something closer to recognition. Or maybe, he said quietly, I chose exactly right. He walked out without another word. Ethan remained where he was, alone in a space that suddenly felt larger and more exposed than before. Because now one thing was clear. Victor was not the architect. He was part of the structure. And somewhere beyond him, someone else had already decided how this would end. The room did not react immediately when Ethan walked in. The board was already seated, screens lit, documents prepared, everything arranged with the precision of a system that believed it was still in control. But something in the air had shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, just enough to make the silence feel heavier than usual. Ethan did not take his seat. He remained standing at the center of the room, his gaze moving slowly across the table, not searching, not questioning, but confirming. Every face, every position, every piece of the structure. Then his eyes stopped. The chairman, calm, composed, watching him without reaction. That was where it ended. You planned the collapse, Ethan said. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the room with absolute clarity. No one interrupted. No one moved. Because the tone was not accusation. It was certainty. Not to protect the company, he continued, but to take it from me. The chairman did not respond immediately. He did not deny it. He did not defend it. He simply observed, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before Ethan stepped into the room. You were becoming unpredictable, he said finally. The words settled differently than expected. Not failure. Not risk. Unpredictable. Ethan let out a slow breath. Almost a laugh. Without humor. So you replaced me, he said. Before I even failed. Before you could, the chairman corrected. That was when everything aligned. Not the betrayal. The timing. This had never been reactive. It had been decided long before the deal, long before the hesitation, long before anything began to shift on the surface. Ethan's gaze moved across the room again, past the executives, past the screens, until it found her. Lily, standing near the glass wall. Still, composed, no longer hidden. You knew, he said. Not a question, not a challenge. A statement. I knew enough, she replied. A pause settled between them. And you still let it happen. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Because if I stopped you, she said, you would never see what you were becoming. The words did not raise her voice, but they carried further than anything else in the room. Ethan did not respond immediately, because for the first time, the conversation was not about the deal. It was not about the company. It was about him. What does that mean? He asked. Lily stepped forward slightly. No distance now. No separation between observer and subject. It means you were already choosing control over truth, she said. Long before they made their move. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if something invisible had been removed, something that had been holding the entire structure in place. Ethan held her gaze, and for the first time, there was no calculation behind it, only recognition. And now, he said quietly, now you choose who you are without the system deciding for you, she replied. A brief pause followed. And that is why you win. The word did not carry power the way it used to. It carried clarity. The chairman leaned back slightly, observing, no longer defending, because there was nothing left to protect. You think this is about your company, he said. His voice calm, measured. This has happened before. Ethan's expression did not change. Different names, different industries. Same pattern, same outcome. The scale shifted instantly. This was not personal. It was systematic. Ethan turned back toward him. I understand enough, he said. Enough to know this was never about the deal. A pause. It was about control. And you were afraid to lose it. The chairman did not respond. Because the system had already revealed itself. And for the first time, Ethan was no longer inside it. The city felt quieter at sunset, not because the noise had disappeared, but because something in Ethan had changed. He stood on the rooftop, the skyline, stretching endlessly in front of him, glass towers catching the last light of the day, reflecting a world he had once believed he controlled completely. For years, everything had been clear. Power was structure. Control was certainty. Outcomes could be shaped, predicted, secured. That was how he built everything. That was how he stayed ahead. But now, standing there, it felt different. Less solid. Less absolute. Like something that only existed as long as you believed it did. Behind him, the door opened softly. He did not turn. He already knew. I was not sure you would come, he said. His voice was calm, but quieter than before, as if the space inside him had shifted. I was not sure you would ask, Lily replied. Her footsteps were steady, unhurried, and when she stopped beside him, there was no distance left between them that needed to be measured. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved below, lights flickering on one by one, a system of its own, vast, complex, impossible to fully control. This time, the silence was not tension. It was not calculation. It was something else. Something unfamiliar. Something real. Ethan glanced at her. No more warnings, he said. Lily shook her head slightly. No more hiding. A faint smile crossed his face, brief, but genuine. For the first time, he said slowly, I did not win by controlling everything. A pause settled between the words, not forced, but natural. I won by letting it go. Lily studied him carefully, her expression softer now, but still searching, as if she needed to see whether this version of him would hold. That is not something you are used to, she said. No, Ethan admitted. And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else he had said that day. Because it was not strategy. It was not positioning. It was truth. He turned to face her fully, closing the last distance between them. Stay, he said. Not a command. Not a demand. Something closer to a risk. Lily did not answer immediately. Her eyes held his, reading him the same way she had from the beginning. Except now she was not looking for patterns or leverage. She was looking for something else. Something that could not be measured. Why? She asked quietly. Ethan did not rush the answer. For the first time, certainty was not the point. Because you were the only person in that room who did not need anything from me, he said. A brief pause followed, and you still chose to stand there. The silence that followed was deeper than before, not empty, but full, like something being decided without needing to be said. Lily looked away for a moment, toward the city, toward everything she had been watching from a distance for so long, then back at him. And if I say no, she asked. Ethan did not hesitate. Then I will still listen, he said. No control, no leverage, just choice. That was the difference. That was the shift. Lily held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly. No more secrets, she said. Not a condition. A boundary. Ethan nodded once. Certain. No more secrets. Below them, the city lights continued to rise, stretching outward into something vast, something unpredictable, something no one could fully control. And for the first time, that did not feel like a threat. It felt like possibility. But somewhere beyond the skyline, beyond the reach of everything he could see, something else was already moving. Not stopped, not finished, just waiting for the next pattern to begin.